Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sattology means science or truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake lie or imagination. Thank you for all my viewers who are using the word Sattology against mythology as an antonym mythology for Ramayana, Mahabharata, Veda, Puran and Upanishad. Because the only mythology that exists is the Abrahamism mystic mythology. Without delay, let us welcome our very special guest, and you would love to see him. He has come through many different connections, and one is my favorite friend, Vaibhav Singhji from Dio News, and also from Jaipur Dialogues, Sanjay Dikshit ji. Without delay, let us hear him. Let's hear him. Namaste and welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for calling me. Thank you so much.
आपको महोदय बोलना पड़ेगा महोदय because
नहीं आप मुझे.
So tell us something about your book, because I was going through the book. The first title that we will do a series of conversations, and the first is British role in creation of Pakistan. तो Pakistan is तो like क्योंकि आइडेंटिटी नहीं है, खुद ने भी नहीं बनाया, किसी और ने बनाया, भारतीय पॉलिटिशियंस की भी मूर्खता हुई, and it is now a state. तो थोड़ा इस पे प्रकाश डालिए.
Yeah. This is the reason my first book in India, a lot of attention is focused on Indo-Pak relations, the nuclear issue, the cross-border terrorism, but nobody studies what is happening inside Pakistan. Okay, what are the problems of Pakistan? Why is it such a troubled state? Why is it such a troublesome state? So when I started writing, I thought to myself, let me go beyond the beaten track and look at the internal happenings in Pakistan. And for that, I began with the very creation of Pakistan. That are the problems of Pakistan current, or are they rooted in its very genesis on how Pakistan was created? And that's how I wrote my first book, Quoting the Abyss, in which the first two chapters deal with the Pakistan movement, the movement that led to the creation of Pakistan and the consequences of that on current day Pakistan. So when you look at the origins of Pakistan, on the Pakistan movement, I realized that from start to finish, it was only the British rule that led to the creation of Pakistan. Without British spoon feeding at every stage, without British spoon feeding, Pakistan would just not have been created. So that in my first chapter, I explain in some detail on that.
So the name Pakistan was kept in London in 1935, I believe.
Yeah, by Rahmat Ali.
Rahmat Ali. And I mean, what was the thinking at that time? Because we have never heard that.
There were a lot of discussion on Hindus, Muslims, things. So this group of students in Cambridge came up with the name Pakistan. It's actually an acronym, beginning with which means Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Balochistan, Sindh, and T.A.N stands for Balochistan. So this was an acronym. And initially Jinnah didn't respond very favorably to Rahmat Ali. He found him to be too excitable, and but the name sort of stuck. But even in the 1940 Lahore Resolution, which is said to be created, laid the foundations of Pakistan, the name Pakistan is not mentioned.
I didn't know that. Like P.A.K.I.S.T.A.N is an acronym.
Yeah, it's an acronym.
And it's not pure. It's not, doesn't mean pure.
The literal meaning is pure. Pak.
Yeah, but it's an acronym is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Balochistan.
Yeah, Sindh and Balochistan. So that is the. But in the 1940 resolution, there is no mention of Pakistan. Though it is called the Pakistan resolution, there is no mention of that. But gradually after 1940, and thanks to the British, actually the British role. Now we'll have to take a deep dive into history.
Please go ahead. Yes.
And the starting point actually is that especially after the 1857 War of Independence, the British realized two things about their rule in India. One was a limitation and one was the objective reality. The limitation was that compared to the population they were governing, the British population or the British people on the ground in India were very, very few. They were not more than 0.5%. So that was the limitation of the British. The objective reality was, as the 1857 War of Independence demonstrated, that if Hindus and Muslims came together, they would be a big danger for the British. So, dealing with this limitation and dealing with this objective reality, what could the British have done? So, there's a very interesting quote, and I'll read it out to you. This was Lord Canning, who was the last Governor General and the first Viceroy of India. In a letter during the Civil War, the War of Independence itself, he wrote, and I quote, "As we must rule 150 million people by a handful of Englishmen, let us do it in a manner best calculated to leave them divided. As in religion and national feeling that they already have, and to inspire them with the greatest possible awe of our power, with the least possible suspicion of our motive." This was to be British policy right till 1947. We keep the Indians divided. Now,
Hindus, mainly Hindus.
yeah, Hindus and Muslims, keep them divided. That they're already divided in religious terms, let's now also divide them in political terms. Now, how did they get rid of the limitation? They got rid of the limitation through education. You know the famous minute of Macaulay of 1835, in which he wrote, "It is impossible for us, with our limited means, to attempt to educate the body of people. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern." Now, this is important. A class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. That through education, you create this class of people who will collaborate with us, who will work for us and help us govern the mass of the millions of Indians who are there in the subcontinent. Now, the Hindus took to education very easily, but the Muslims did not, because the ulamas told them that you are going away from Islam, Western culture is not good for you, and so on and so forth. So, the Muslims soon realized that their traditional Persian-based education was of no use in getting administrative posts. Thus, there was a huge educational and intellectual imbalance. For example, between 1858 and 1878, there were 1,370 bachelors, PAs, and 326 MAs who emerged from India's colleges and universities. Of them, only 30 were Muslims, BAs, and 5 Muslim MAs. Now, the British realized that, look, this is going to create a problem. So, what do? So, the Viceroy at that time, Lord Mayo, he commissioned a civil servant, William Hunter, to examine the burning question: are Indian Muslims bound by the religion to rebel against the Queen? Hunter studied a lot and came up with a book called The Indian Muslims. It's a classic book, The Indian Muslims. And the conclusion they reached was that you have to pay special attention to the problem of Muslim education, and how do you adopt measures that will attract Muslim gentlemen's sons into government schools. As a result, in 20 years, the British were able to turn, through discrimination in education and jobs and political empowerment, a hostile Muslim community into a resource for the Indian Empire. Right? And the British found in Sayyid Ahmad Khan a willing person who would cooperate with them. who wanted to prove to the British that Muslims are not disloyal and wanted to prove to the Muslims that you have to take Western education. So the British gifted him a piece of land in Aligarh where the Oriental Anglo-Muslim school was set up. Started as a primary school, gradually became a Bachelor Arts, and today you know it as the Aligarh Muslim University. So that was how the British helped the Muslims start education, because there was a great deal of reluctance. Right? In the meanwhile, the Congress or the Hindus were raising questions, were taken to Western education and learned about, freedom and free speech and things like that. They had started asking questions which the British found uncomfortable. To channelize this, the British helped A.O. Hume to set up the Indian National Congress in 1885. They thought that there will be a debating society. They will come and they'll let off steam and talk, and they would not create a problem for us. But within 3 years, by 1888, the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, called the Congress a seditious and microscopic minority. And the reason for the Muslims have started joining the Congress. There were the number of Muslim delegates to the annual sessions of the Congress had started increasing. Now this worried the British, because if they felt that if the Muslims and Hindus were to come together in the Congress, it will create problems for us. Right? So what they did was they used a couple of instruments to make sure that this trend does not continue. So what the first and most important thing was the delegation of 35 Muslim notables led by the Aga Khan, who met the Viceroy in Simla on 1st October 1906. Now, this is a very, very significant date in Indian history. They submitted a memorandum to the Viceroy asking for separate electorates for the Muslims and representation in excess of the numerical strength, in view of the value of the contribution of Muslims were making to the defense of the empire. And Minto said, who was the Viceroy, and I quote, "I'm as firmly convinced as I believe you to be that any electoral representation in India would be doomed to mischievous failure, which aimed at granting a personal enfranchisement regardless of the beliefs and traditions of the communities composing the population of this continent." You see how dangerous this was. Representative government and democracy is one man, one vote. It's a personal enfranchisement. And here he was saying that there cannot be personal enfranchisement without taking into account the beliefs and traditions of the communities composing the population of this continent, basically the Muslims. And subsequently, Lady Minto in her diary wrote that night, showing the importance of the meeting, that it is nothing less than the pulling back of 62 million people from joining the ranks of the seditious opposition. They recognized straight away how important this meeting was and what they had done. And the really significant thing was that the draft of the memorandum was actually done by Mohsin ul Mulk, who was the secretary of the Aligarh College, and the principal, Archibald. And they discussed with the Viceroy's Private Secretary, Dunlop Smith. And the memorandum was drafted before the meeting. And the Muslim delegation just read out the memorandum, which had already been agreed to by the British. Thus, the whole delegation was stage managed, and it proved to be a game changer, because it rejected personal enfranchisement and moved towards reservation. And this was followed in 1909 by the Morley-Minto reforms, which provided for separate electorates for the Muslims. And once you accept separate electorates and this separation, all future constitutional proposals made for India by successive British governments continued to be the separate electorates. And the inevitable consequence of this was the partition of India and the emergence of Pakistan. Because in future, Hindus and Muslims would campaign, electioneer on religion instead of political grounds. And it was so entrenched and so established that nobody could do away with it in the future. The second thing that the British did was the partition of Bengal in 1905. Though they said it was being partitioned on administrative lines, it was actually partitioned on religious lines. Once again, the principle that you can partition territory on the basis of religion came to be established. Right, so 1905 partition of Bengal, 1906 the Simla delegation. Also in 1906, the British sanctioned an amount of 14 lakhs to the Nawab of Dhaka, who then called for a meeting of Muslim notables, and the All India Muslim League was set up in Dhaka in 1906 thanks to the funding provided by the British. Right? So,
It's like a Treaty of Westphalia mindset. Divide and everybody, like exactly like that.
yeah.
Nation state concept based on religions not fighting. Yes.
Yeah. So, this is one part of the equation. The other part of the equation was that the British needed Muslim League they had set up, but they needed somebody who would unify the Muslims. Because while the Muslims who were active in politics were willing to accept the leadership of the British, they were unwilling to accept the leadership of any other Muslim. So they needed a man, somebody who would do their bidding. There were two people who were prominent, the British found. One was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the second was Muhammad Shafi, who was also a prominent Muslim politician. What the British did was that they worked on Jinnah positively and they told Shafi, you better tie up with Jinnah. And by 1929, the two had patched up and Jinnah emerged as the sole leader of the Muslims in the Muslim League. So that was one. They made the Muslims and came up to Jinnah. But the British also found that the Muslim League was basically a dormant body. The famous 1930 Allahabad session where Iqbal made his historic address about the destination of the Muslims, the League did not even have a quorum of 75 members. So, again, the Viceroy wrote to the Secretary of State in London, our backers form a flabby crowd without any courage, while the Congress, however stupid their actions, are not afraid of fighting. Right, so they really despaired that what's going to happen to the Muslim League, how will they serve as a counter to the Congress? Meanwhile, Jinnah had left for London and he was asked to come back. He came back in October 1935. And most people credit Liaquat Ali Khan or Iqbal or actually in Ahmadiyya, Abdul Rahim Dard for having brought Jinnah back. But there is also a possibility. There is evidence that there was secret correspondence between Jinnah and Churchill, which was routed through one Elizabeth Gilliatt, a lady employed in Churchill's home in Kent, to avoid detection. Right? So there was secret correspondence, and Churchill, and so they encouraged him to go back.
And Churchill hated India like anything.
Yeah. And Churchill also influenced two other viceroys, Linlithgow and Wavell, to help Jinnah as much as they could because they were very close to Churchill. Right, so we fast forward a bit that in the 1937 elections, the Muslim League didn't make any dent at all. And the Congress established ministries in majority of the provinces. But once the Second World War broke out, the British resigned from the ministries saying that the war aims have not been declared and you have not consulted us. So they resigned. This provided Jinnah and the Muslim League an opportunity to endear themselves to the British because they held fast and continued to be loyal to the British. Now, post 19th. Sorry.
It's a disease in the Islamic world. They hate Western culture but love Western corruption. They love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Please.
then, in March 1940, Jinnah delivered his famous presidential address to the Muslim League's open section in Lahore. And I quote, he said, Hinduism and Islam are not religions in the strict sense of the word, but are in fact different and distinct social orders. And it is a dream that Hindus and Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. The Hindus and Muslims belong to two different religions, philosophies, social customs, and literature. And indeed, they belong to two different civilizations which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. Once again, it's very interesting that it was the Viceroy Lilithgau who, in March 1940, had instructed Zafarullah Khan, who was a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council, to convey to the League leadership that the government wanted it to demand a separate state. And the memorandum and Jinnah's speech was actually written by Zafarullah Khan on the subject of two dominion states. But Zafarullah Khan was an emir, so he was not keen that his name should appear as being the author. So it was said that Jinnah has said this. But actually, it was the British, like they had drafted the Simla Manifesto in 1906, they also drafted the 1940 Lahore Resolution, which was presented. So, and by this time, the British made it sure that any Muslim who wanted to get any favors from the British had to be a part of the Muslim League and had to accept Jinnah as the leader. There was this similar conference in 1946 which broke up because Jinnah wanted not only that he will nominate members of the Muslim League, but he also wanted the right to nominate the Muslim members that the Congress would nominate. Can you imagine? He went to the extent of saying that even the Congress, Muslim members of the Congress will be nominated by me. Obviously, the Congress refused to accept this and the Simla conference broke down. Now, it is very interesting that Dr. Khan Saab, who was the chief minister of NWFP, the Khudai Khidmatgar Congress government in NWFP. So he told Lord Wavell that I am the chief minister of the largest Muslim province, but not a member of the Muslim League. What do you have to say to me? So this was most embarrassing for the British, and hence Wavell's answer has not been recorded. Then further, even Churchill, he told Mountbatten in May 1947, Jinnah is one man who cannot do without British help. So this makes it clear that at every stage, at every important turn in the development of India from 1906 onwards, it was the British who helped, and ultimately that led to the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan. And one other thing which is very interesting, that up to May 1946, the British General Staff were of the view that to prevent a Soviet threat to India and the oil fields of the Middle East, Britain must retain its military connection to the subcontinent. But a year later, by 1947, the British General Staff had changed their view, and they recorded that it would be good for Britain if Pakistan remains in the Commonwealth, and all our strategic requirements can be met by an agreement with Pakistan alone. We do not therefore consider that failure to obtain the agreement with India would cause us to modify any of our requirement. This was a changed assessment that proved to be the last nail in the coffin of Indian unity. So, in this manner, you can see that at every stage, how the British helped in the creation of Pakistan and for Pakistan to come. And now, if you like, I can give you the two. This is a general picture. The two specific examples of Balochistan, three actually: Balochistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, and NWFP. Of how specifically the British ensured that Pakistan would be a viable entity. You see, initially, the British Kalat they had taken over by a treaty of 1876, in which they promised to uphold the sovereignty of Kalat. Kalat, as Baluchistan was called. And this was translated in a memorandum that was signed by Jinnah and by Kalat in August 1947 that said that Kalat would be an independent state on the creation of Pakistan. So accordingly, Khan of Kalat on 11th of August, 12th of August, sorry, declared the independence of Kalat. Right? He thereafter set up a constitution, set up a bicameral legislature and things. And Jinnah was on board, accepted this. But by October, within 2 months, Jinnah had a change of mind and started pressing Kalat to accede to Pakistan. Why was this sudden somersault? Here again, documents which are available show that the British advice influenced Jinnah to force the accession of Kalat. For example, there was a report which was published in, it was formulated in 1944 about post-war reconstruction in Balochistan. And the British felt that Balochistan was the right place for a considerable imperial garrison after the war. Right? Therefore, the British said, fine, let Kalat be an independent state. But by 1947, the British felt that instead of locating a base in a weak Balochistan, such a base could be established in Pakistan that was more than willing to accommodate the British. Accordingly, Pakistan had to be made viable, and therefore Mountbatten was informed that it was too dangerous and risky to allow Kalat to be independent. And instructions were sent to the British High Commissioner in Karachi to inform Jinnah that he should not accept the independence of Kalat and make sure that Kalat accedes to Pakistan. Right? And it was then that Jinnah started having second thoughts about the recognition of Kalat as an independent state and forced the accession in March 1948 of the Khan of Kalat. Again, it was the British prompting that led to this. Similarly, on the Afghanistan, the Durand Line you would have heard of, very famous. The 1893 agreement had fixed only the limits of respective spheres of influence between Afghanistan and British India. It was not a demarcation of sovereignty. And in fact, the Mortimer Durand himself stated that it should be clearly understood that nothing is further from our intention than the annexation of tribal country on our frontier. The tribes on the Indian side are not to be considered as within British territory. They are simply under our influence in the technical sense of the term, that is to say, so far as the Amir is concerned, and as far as they submit to our influence or we exert it. Basically, the British wanted a buffer state between British India and Afghanistan, which was this tribal belt. But after the creation of Pakistan, once again the British realized that look, if you want to have a stronger Pakistan, then we cannot allow this Pashtun territory to go back to Afghanistan. It can no longer be a sphere of influence. Thus, from 1893 to 1947, the British accepted it is only spheres of influence and there was no transfer of sovereignty. After the creation of Pakistan, the British started saying, no, the Durand Line is an international border. And thus Afghanistan lost a huge chunk of its territory. The entire portion today, which is NWFP, was actually a part of Afghanistan. And especially this tribal belt, which is called FATA, Federally Administered Tribal Areas, and now is part of the settled districts, became part of Pakistan as a result of British perfidy. That instead of accepting the 1893 Durand Line as spheres of influence, they started treating it as an international border. Similarly with Gilgit-Baltistan, the British impression was, or the British calculation was, that the Maharaja of Kashmir would accede to Pakistan. Now, when he did accede to Pakistan, after the raiders went in and acceded instead to India, what the British did was, I mean, this is speculative as yet, not documented, but it's assessment that they sent a telegram to Major Brown, who was in charge of the Gilgit Scouts in the Gilgit Agency. And he then captured the Kashmir governor, Gansara Singh, sent a message to Pakistan and handed over the area of Gilgit-Baltistan to Pakistan, because the British did not want that India should have a connection with the Soviet Union. So they wanted this area to go to Pakistan rather than to come to India. So these three specific cases, Gilgit-Baltistan, NWFP and Balochistan, it was again British machinations that made sure that these territories came to Pakistan to bolster Pakistan, because they felt that Pakistan would be very useful to them for dealing with the Soviet Union and for the protection of the oil fields of the Middle East. So not only did the British create Pakistan, they helped Pakistan to actually become a solid entity, with these three areas.
I always wonder. I've lived in London 3 years. Such low IQ, low caliber people. I mean, general population. How could they plan all these things without Indian help? Did you find the Indian connection to these people also?
One thing about the British from my readings, they had an imperial vision. I'm not talking about the mass of the people, but at the top, the military leadership, the political leadership, they had an imperial vision. And at that time, I think they knew exactly what they were doing. Otherwise, they have this concept of a triple frontier. And those day and ages, how could have come up with this? They said you have one frontier, which is the settled area. Let's say like Sindh or NWFP. Beyond that, you have a second frontier, which is a buffer. And beyond that, you have the third frontier, which is the frontier of the buffer with the another international or European power. Case of Afghanistan was the buffer, and then you are Russia. So this imperial conception that they had about borders and how to govern and how to rule. Otherwise, how do you think they could have ruled a country for 200 million people at that time with barely 100,000 British? So it was the imagination, the imperial vision. Today, of course, there has been so much of deterioration, as you rightly say, as the country has shrunk. They have lost their empire. So that imperial vision, I think, has been dented largely.
No, I think there was a innate I feel that the people of India were not used to such kind of machinations by anybody. Like they were not even aware that people can do this much. They can do to this level. I think that it's the evilness of their mind. It shows that how far they could go, how far they could think. Like same thing happened with the Native Americans. I mean, they used the goodness of Native Americans to rule over them. And the same thing, the goodness of heart of the Indians to rule over them. Like basically breaking trust of so many people who were thinking of them to be a good person, or doing some charity to them, and so that they can return in return. What do you think?
Also, at the same time, we have to recognize our own weakness. Our weakness was that we were so divided. We were so disunited. Everybody was looking for their choti riyasat, little bit of this thing, not looking at the larger picture. So I think we must also look within and make sure that this never happens again.
You're right. I think we should look ourselves within, and I think we can flog ourselves as much as we can. But I will also say that the innocence of people, like we can flagellate ourselves so much that we could not imagine that somebody could do that. Our leaders could not imagine. I mean, there were fights between different kings. I understand that, but they all could not imagine that somebody could go to that extent. Is it possible or not?
And use one against the other.
Yes.
Use one. You see, like Alexander, when he fought against Porus, the king of Takshila was supporting Alexander. Instead of supporting Porus, he was concerned about his A small
Small.
kingdom.
That's right. That's right. So one thing I want to get into the mindset. Do you ever encounter? So these are all MI6 operations, British
No, no, these
intelligence.
are the British. See, till 1857, it was the East India Company, company of basically traders and merchants. And they had administrators, they had their civil service, they had their own army. The Bengal Native Army was set up by the East India Company. So no intelligence. Intelligence was set up much later.
I think the intelligence came after 1857. The British Crown was involved. I mean,
Yeah,
the English traders were just busy supplying clothes and women to Jahangir Fort and happy with that. And Jahangir was selling them everything they want from Kolkata port.
but when they went to Bengal and they realized how rich it was, and more than their trade, the richness of Bengal, and because it was so disunited and easy. So, Plassey, Battle of Plassey, one of the most historic battles in India, as was the Third Battle of Panipat. The Third Battle of Panipat, where Abdali defeated the Marathas, the real beneficiaries of that were the British, because the dominant power in India was the Marathas. They ruled right up to the Indus. So their power was shattered. Abdali went back to Afghanistan, leaving only the British in the fray. So these two battles, Plassey and the Third Battle of Panipat, were really critical in the history of India.
Also, the British picked up small battles. They did not pick up big battles. They focused on one point and then they spread the news of that victory everywhere. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So they were tactical. Yeah, they had some very good. I mean, if you read, especially if I've done a little bit of reading on the northwest frontier, how they expanded, how they controlled the area. So they had, some excellent leaders, civil servants, some from the army, who were able to establish the British Empire in the northwest frontier. They were, men of integrity, men of character, and persons who knew the Pathans, knew the language, knew their customs, lived with them, and the loyalty they generated among the people, whether whoever it was absolutely amazing. When you read about it, I'll give you an example. There was a John Nicholson who became very famous in the siege of Delhi and died over there. But his initial activities were in the northwest frontier. And he was so famous because of his fairness and his administration of tough justice, but fair, that a group of people started calling themselves Nicholsonis. They started worshipping him. Can you imagine? A band of people called themselves Nicholsonis. That, he is our God and we worship him. So that is the kind of admiration that some of these people were able to uh, engender among the population that they governed. So I think very good and tough governance, fair, absolutely fair, with justice and men of integrity and character. So that also, I think played a part, played a major part. The right
So
people in the right place.
what I heard also, these generals were Scottish generals, not English
Yes.
generals,
Yeah. True. True.
because in the Church
Because
of
Scotland
England,
was a poor place, not much happening there. All the wealth was concentrated in England. So a lot of the people, initially people who came out of the East India Company and as administrators, army and civil servants, were largely from Scotland.
because there was an agreement between the England and Scotland that the military will be led by the Scottish and the trade will be led by the English. That was the agreement.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was the agreement. That's why the most of the generals were Scottish. In fact, the top generals were only 100,000 were the other soldiers, mercenaries, because the British used a lot of mercenaries everywhere. Till date, they use it. It's a mercenary. The entire military, British military today is a mercenary army, even today.
So somebody told me the story that in the duel, two people have an argument and they go out and have a duel and they shoot themselves. That was banned, but the practice continued. And to escape punishment or in his case, escape imprisonment, the person who won the duel and killed the other man, he would catch a ship and come to India. Because in India, there was no law on this. And he continued to serve the British.
After 1857 and after 1857, there was a ban on Hindus to come to USA because the English were scared that Hindus will make Native Americans stronger and kick them out of USA. And again, it was ratified in the court in 1923 in the Supreme Court of USA. The Indians cannot
Okay.
come here. Yes,
Really?
twice. Yes. Udham Singh came to where I live in San Diego. Udham Singh came to El Centro, which is around 100 miles north from me, east from me. And there, El Centro, the Udham Singh is there. And then from USA, he went to UK to kill General Dyer.
Okay. So there
That's
was
what he,
also the Ghadar movement in the US.
1838, yes. And Ghadar movement was created by the British against the Hindus to divide India. That's why
Okay.
all the Khalistani elements came from there. All these elements are still again a British ploy. Keep Sikhs separate, and they also spread the rumor that the Sikh is a martial race. I mean, in our culture, Kshatriya is a martial race. Kshatriya are everywhere. Kshatriyas are in Bengal. Kshatriyas are everywhere. All over the communities are there.
See, after 1857, they stopped recruiting the Bengal infantry or people from UP because they had participated the most. So they needed replacements. So then it was the Punjabis, the Dogras, the Pathans in large numbers, and they started calling them martial races to
Yeah,
fill
I
the
mean,
army.
the most powerful martial race is from Maharashtra. They are the ones who kicked out the Mughal rule, entire
Yeah.
Islamic rule, and they never fought straight. They always fought behind the scene, behind the lines. So guerrilla warfare was perfected by Shivaji Maharaj. I'm from Solapur, so I'm a little bit biased also from Maharashtra, but
Okay.
but generally,
Well, that's true. It's very true. Very true. I mean, what he was
and
able to achieve is absolutely amazing.
there is a joke which my grandmother used to say: when the Punjabis are doing Bhangra, we kick the Islam out of India.
Well, I am a Punjabi, so I have mixed feelings about that.
You know, and there is a very classical joke in USA which I say to a lot of Americans is that when an American is constipated, he sounds just like British. One question I have for you. So when you study the, because I'm a student of the mindset of these people, because it is important to understand their mindset, what's going on in their minds. Were they thinking Hindus to be very weak? Means one thing is very clear: they thought Hindus to be smarter than Muslims because we would debate with them, and they don't like debates. Even till date, they don't like debates. If you ask too many questions at Oxford, you'll be kicked out. So it's a very classical thing. Oxford, Cambridge, you can ask many questions. So, but what is their mindset when they dealt with the Hindus versus Muslims? What they were thinking?
You see, I think initially after 1857, they felt that the mutiny had been created and led by the Muslims. So there was a certain suspicion of the Muslims. And the Hindus had taken to Western education and they filled the lower administrative posts. But then they realized that the Hindus were far more intelligent. you know. So this Congress was basically set up that you let them let off steam. So their attitude towards the Hindus was always that these are very intelligent, very clever people. Their arguments, their kind of, they will use the British literature, against them, whereas the Muslims are far more, amenable to being manipulated because they were far more simpler. They were not so bright. They were not so intelligent. So that's how they used one against the other. And this thing about martial races, they also realized that in fact the entire Bengal infantry, bulk of it was Hindu. UP also people whom they recruited, Punjabis whom they recruited, Dogras. So there was no such thing that Hindus are not martial races. It was just what they found convenient to label who as martial races.
So this is the same period, around 200 years ago, approximately, same period, 1890s or 1900s, early 1900s. We see that the 240,000 Indians were brought to South America. Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Caribbean, and Belize. Big population of Hindus were brought in here, and they're all from the same belt: Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, mostly Madhya Pradesh, and some part, sometimes Karnataka too. But was that a strategy also, that take these prominent voices out to these new territories and let them colonize them, except USA?
I think they were taken as indentured labor, basically to work in the sugar fields. So the people who went, or people who were taken there, were not the educated, not the people who could argue or create arguments. It was the labor, you know. So
What are,
it was the labor class.
so what was the composition of Hindus versus Muslims in this British army during this time?
I don't have those figures. I don't have those figures, but I think they kept a fairly close, proportion of both. In some localized pockets, the Pathans especially would have been more. In other cases, they were Sikhs, they were Gurkhas, they were Dogras, Rajputs. So they had a mixed, a mixed kind of a thing. They made sure that there was not the dominance of any one particular religion or ethnicity.
The World War I, in World War I, I think the Muslim soldiers revolted against fighting the Ottoman Empire, and then the Hindu soldiers, Sikh soldiers, were brought in to fight with the Ottoman Empire. Haifa victory and the Jerusalem victory and all these things, and then they were shown in the France too. Because Ottoman Empire, the France and English fought together. Not just it was not just France. So how do you see that? Did that change anything in them? So they
No, I
used
think,
Hindus.
yeah, they had learned their lesson after 1857 that you have to keep in mind the religious sensitivities. That if some person is, sensitive about, see, in the case of the Hindus, there was no such religious sensitivities involved because the Hindus have always been insular. It's always been in India. It's not that you have a problem going out and fighting anywhere. The people who are in the army, whereas Islam and the Muslims have a certain loyalty, looked up to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire, as part of the Ummah, or whatever it was. So that sensitivity was there, and so the British must have taken this factor into consideration and decided not to use that.
Did that you mentioned about World War II? Now World War II, there's a very famous statement by Attlee that contribution of Mahatma Gandhi was negligible, and he's noted gave it to Subhash Chandra Bose, and also the Indian British naval soldiers revolt against the British Empire. Did you factor that? What do you see in that?
No, I think post Second World War, it was the naval mutiny and the feeling of Subhash Chandra Bose that actually made the British think very seriously about how long can they continue in India. It was not so much the national movement was of course there, the growing civil disobedience movement, Quit India, 1942. But it was equally, you see, the British knew that they could hold on to India only if with the strength of the army, the navy, if that started having a disaffection, they were lost, they were sunk, they had to leave. So I think the naval mutiny is something that has not been given the due importance that it needs to be done. Subhash Chandra Bose, of course, was a very major compliment in making the British change their attitude. And of course, I think it's wrong to say that Gandhiji did not have any impact. He and the Congress actually brought the consciousness of Indian unity, Indian freedom, Indian national movement to the people at a time when there was no internet. There was trains, snail mail. How did they manage to unify the entire country? So you can't say that he had no contribution. That's unfair.
To some level, yes. I mean, some contribution was definitely there, no doubt about it. One last question I had, like British were colonizing America at that time, fighting with the French, fighting with the Spaniards, fighting with the Dutch, fighting with the Russians. I mean, most of the viewers will know Fort Russo in California was a Russian colony, and fighting with the Native Americans, like fighting on all sides, and the World War II. So, and the US was also giving them trouble. US was not helping them. US was supporting India's independence movement. US was supporting every single independence movement that went against the British. So, what was going on in the British minds at that time trying to hold on to India? What do you think?
So that's why after the Second World War, they were totally exhausted. They knew they could not hold on to India and gradually the rest of the colonies also. They were totally exhausted. That you cannot sustain, and the primary concern was safety of the British Isles. When Hitler launched his blitzkrieg, that was the main threat to them. How to ensure the survival of the British Isles from the onslaught of the Germans. And then, of course, the tide turned and they were able to push Hitler back and ultimately gain victory. But they were exhausted financially, or exhausted militarily, in terms of manpower, in terms of rebuilding. So, in fact, it's a very famous incident that when Churchill was asked after the Second World War that the British Chiefs of Staff asked him that we need to make our plans for the future and what should we prepare for the next war. And Churchill said, not at all. There is no question of the next war that, we can't handle it. Basically, that's what he meant. We can't handle it.
Even today,
I think the exact word was not for the 10 years, and the 10-year rule begins every day.
no, if you look at the British military fights and everything, 1,500 soldiers, 100 soldiers, 500 soldiers, 1,000 soldiers, 6,000 soldiers maximum in all over the world, pinpointed small battles and big glorification in the media. That was the whole tactic actually. They never felt like when the Vajpayee did the build up on the borders, they were scared. They were counting the soldiers. They never imagined that this big armies two sides can arrange actually. But they were always interested in small wars. Or हम लोग का idea is like Mahabharat. We go all out. They don't do that. They do small battles, and that's what the
It's a
that's what
question of
they
manpower. I mean, manpower is limited.
limited, and also capability is also not there. Like they sent the empty ship in the Gulf of Aden, like no missiles on it, and they thought that people would be scared of it. And the Russia was helping Houthis fire those missiles. I was the first one to say that it's Russia doing it, not Iran. With such a precision attack against Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier cannot be done by small Houthi terrorist rebels. They cannot do it. They can't even locate it on the ocean. It's like in the ocean, aircraft carrier is a very small thing. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I would like to make it a series. And in a true Sattology style, we'll go deep into everything. And I love the way you put out all the answers actually for the viewers. I'm sure viewers will love it. Do comment it, like it, share it, and let me know your feedback. Thank you, Tilak.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for calling
Thank
me.
you. Namaste.
Enjoyed
Thank you.
talking to you and look forward to continuing our association.
Yes,
Jai Hind.
yes. Jai Hind. Jai Hind.